This comes from back in 2014, but Supreme Court Justice, much mourned Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, may she rest in peace, used to say that she was often asked how many women on the Supreme Court in America would be enough. Her answer was, when there are 9. Because for most of the country's history, there were 9 and they were all men. Nobody thought that was strange, she explained. She has traditionally been a very good barometer while she was alive of changing mores in America. And that is what I think we need to look at in the field of AI governance right now. Because, where are we? Really, we can see 2 cultures in the field of at least fairness, if not AI governance in general. First, there is the sort of broadening aspect of the field where computer science is coming into contact with social science, and where there is often uncomfortable but opening up discussion of how to take into account social movements in the work of computer science and AI particularly. Separately from that, there is a countervailing force that says, no, responsible computing is about setting the right requirements and then letting everybody do their jobs. That we just need to, we being basically social scientists and philosophers and lawyers, need to come up with the right requirements so that computer science can proceed with innovation, with creating AI, and with moving the field forward. And these 2 things have come into conflict increasingly over the last couple of years. Because there are 2 positions on formalizing fairness, which is essentially what we're talking about when we talk about responsibility and requirements engineering. The first idea is that we have to formalize fairness because we need a target for the creation of standards and requirements so that algorithmic systems can possibly be regulated effectively. And also that the idea of searching for conceptual clarity on fairness makes this discussion more inclusive of technical disciplines and applied legal perspectives, which are very important to preventing problems with AI. We can't do governance without them. A countervailing movement says fairness must not be formalized and cannot be formalized, in fact, because it does not tell us anything about whether a particular application should be deployed at all. And because the formalization of standards and requirements, such as around the idea of fairness, can be used strategically to distract society and legislators from more fundamental issues, which they should in fact be dealing with. Within this, there are many intersecting and possibly competing framings of risk, many of which have come up in this conference so far. And when one of us works on one of these framings, we tend to believe that it's the most important. And these are all actually competing, including, God forbid, the final option here, which is singularitarianism, which does still pop up every now and then. There's a whole community working on the idea that AI is actually going to take over the world. And it's important to take these all into account when we think about the field for governance. So one of the papers that I use to teach on this is something probably a lot of people here have read. It's Os Keys et al.'s paper on a mulching proposal, riffing on the idea from Swift in the 18th century on his modest proposal, which covers a hypothetical corporate proposal for an algorithmic system for turning the unwanted elderly into high nutrient slurry, so essentially into food. So their fictional company, Logan Nolan Industries, proposes a scheme where elderly people who are essentially unwanted are selected to be turned into food, which is then fed back into the food chain. Here is their wonderful image. They use this to explain how algorithmic fairness does not cover all the bases that we're interested in covering right now, because this scheme obeys all the principles that are in play in the field. It treats everyone similarly. The model was fed training images of women, trans people, and people of color, so it wouldn't discriminate by focusing on one group over another. And here we are back with the discussion between Sandra and Joanna yesterday at the start of the conference. It makes its algorithmic decisions transparent and explainable. It will provide a list of variables and subjects scores on each before it mulches them. There's public signage to ensure there's noticed and informed consent, and the company allows independent researchers to audit the code. So the authors explain that, of course, this is a satirical paper, but that it makes a real point about how our existing requirements for fairness are unlikely to take us in the direction of justice, unless we can consider overall business models and the overall mission of the technology that we're considering governing. This situation has led to AI governance becoming a profoundly antagonistic process. And here I'd like to bring in the work of Nancy Fraser, who came up in 2008, so a while ago, with the idea of abnormal justice as a response to globalization. She says that post-globalization, the framing of justice claims, which is what fundamentally governance has to deal with, has been disrupted so that deviation becomes less the exception than the rule. She names these disruptions as being around geography, that claims for agency and redress often stretch across and between territorial states and jurisdictions. The subjects of justice have become collective as well as individuals. So a framing where, as Julie Cohen would put it, the liberal Western individual idea of the justice claimant, of a legal subject, doesn't fit very well with the kind of claims we're seeing. Who should determine what is just has also been disrupted, as we can see all around us, and whose interests should be considered. Is it the user or is it everybody, or a mixture thereof? The nature of the claims to redistribution and redress has changed as well. It's gone from economic power to cultural particularly, and connected to that political power. Also, which social cleavages can be the sites of injustice has expanded radically. Nationality, class, ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, disability probably doesn't even cover it anymore. And this is all interesting and new. So I would like to look at how abnormal justice claims in relation to AI are actually manifesting in public debate and how we might take account of those. So here's one that I imagine everyone here has seen. Visible, consistent pushback by underrepresented groups against the growing power of AI systems and epistemologies goes along with public conflict with established interests. Perhaps the most high-profile account of this has been given by Timnit Gebru quite recently when she was fired by Google. But what's interesting here is the amount of controversy that accompanied that and how it became a public issue, which I think 10 years ago would not have happened, because Google is seen as not only an important company, but as a company which is in some ways managing the public sphere. And it really matters who Google takes account of and who it doesn't. And we see a lot of factionalization. I mean, this is sort of the Dreyfus case of our time. This is something where people range on both sides around issues that are profoundly cultural and political, and it doesn't go away easily. We're also seeing the connection of claims against discriminatory AI to broader political and social movements, as we saw with the firing of Timnit as well, with the response to that. So we're seeing movements connecting AI and the data economy in general to social justice concerns that include civil rights very broadly, precarity in labor markets, criminal justice, housing, welfare. These are happening in America, but they're also happening in Germany, where this conference is based. Algorithm Watch has been tackling issues that are quite fundamental to the German economy and to the notion of political participation in Germany, as have other groups. And this is very much a discussion that is broadening out. We're also seeing employee resistance movements where walkouts, letters, protests around gender and racial discrimination and harassment, political engagement or disengagement in various ways by tech firms or people work, environmental sustainability and the precarization of labor are all coming into play in terms of demands that are being made of private sector companies. Again, this is not something that was happening maybe 10 or 20 years ago. There's also growing demands for engagement with social justice issues directly by AI developers, deployers, and educators in the AI field. Again, we've seen very acrimonious exchanges around the issue of bias, but also connecting that to broader issues around climate change, around structural justice. There's been a lot of controversy around, for instance, near IPS introducing a requirement for authors to write about the broader impact of their papers, including ethical aspects and future societal consequences. And again, here, it's less about debating whether this is the right thing to do and more about noticing the kind and quality and breadth of controversy that is occurring around this and seeing how deep-seated that is becoming and trying to figure out what that means for governance more broadly. Finally, we also see contestation, even by established interests, of private sector capture of regulatory and ethics discussions. So this is Thomas Metzinger, publishing in Der Tagesspiegel, I think, where he said that he was on the EU's high-level expert group on AI, and that it was a case of ethical whitewashing because the process was captured by 48 out of 52 members, I think, of the committee of the high-level expert group, who were representing corporate interests. And we can debate the place of corporate interests in AI governance. But this was an interesting case because somebody spoke out very publicly, whereas normally a philosopher would not necessarily be doing that. What did he speak out about? Well, this is what he spoke out about: the draft ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, which were produced by the EU. Here is the draft version before the final version. As you can see, it has examples of opportunities and critical concerns raised by AI. So these are essentially red lines proposed by the group. Between the second to last draft and the final draft, this section C completely disappeared. As you can see, there's now section B and then a conclusion, and the red lines have been cut out of the document. And what Thomas Metzinger recounted was the story of how that happened and how people agreed on red lines broadly, and then the corporate interests on the high-level expert group got together and decided that the idea of red lines should not exist for AI. These are the critical concerns that disappeared from the AI guidance: identifying and tracking people, covert AI systems, AI-enabled citizen scoring in violation of fundamental rights, and laws, lethal autonomous weapon systems. It's kind of surprising that anyone thought that these shouldn't be red lines, but again, we should look at the controversy mainly about their disappearance rather than debate whether these. I think it's fairly clear that these are all a bad idea and that we don't wish for these to happen in the world. But how we stop them happening is changing processually. And that for me is the interesting thing here. So let's get to what is that processual change? Well, one thing that people are noticing is that we don't have the kind of legal subject that we had when data protection was first conceptualized. Data protection is not working well to protect things that we wish to protect with regard to AI governance. Structural disempowerment maybe needs to be more fully considered when we talk about governing AI. Given that the tools we have are not working for us very well, conflict and contestation maybe are not a bug, but a feature of the process of governance that requires attention and restructuring. We have to name the big problems in order to address the smaller ones. If we want to learn from what we might call the fairness phase of AI governance, we also need to find ways to connect these big structural problems and their societal expressions, very importantly, the things I've just been covering, with law and regulation. We need to go from the idea of requirements to the idea of engagement with a constantly changing field of demands and